On February 27, 2025, a man who helped build one of the most terrifying criminal organizations in human history was handed over to U.S. authorities in chains. And on April 7, 2026, Eric Valencia Salazar, co-founder of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, stood in a Washington, D.C. federal courtroom and pleaded guilty. The cartel he helped create has shipped tons of cocaine, meth, and fentanyl into the United States, turned entire Mexican states into war zones, and answered every threat with mass slaughter. And now, one of the men who built all of that is staring down a life sentence in an American prison. So buckle up, because we are breaking down the full story behind the CJNG co-founder who just pleaded guilty, and the insane road that led him here. Let's get into it. If you've been rocking with this channel for a while, you already know who we're talking about when we say CJNG. But if you're new here, welcome and strap yourself in. Because to truly understand what Eric Valencia Salazar pleading guilty actually means, you need to understand the monster he helped create. And trust me, hitting that like button before we go any further is the right move, because what we're about to get into is one of the most layered, most explosive cartel stories of the decade. Let's start at the beginning. Eric Valencia Salazar goes by the alias L85. That's it, just a number. No flashy nickname, no dramatic cartel title, just a number that somehow became one of the most feared identifiers in Mexico's criminal underworld. Born in Santa Clara, California, yes, California, Valencia Salazar is technically American-born, which makes what he went on to build in Mexico even more wild when you think about it. He didn't grow up inside some Jalisco village surrounded by cartel culture. He came from the other side of the border. But somewhere along the line, the path he chose led him straight into the heart of Mexico's most violent criminal enterprise. And he didn't just join it, he co-founded it. Before the CJNG existed, before El Mencho became the most wanted man in North America, before any of that, there was the Milenio Cartel. And that's where L85's story truly begins. The Milenio Cartel was a powerful drug trafficking organization that ran operations through the Mexican states of Jalisco, Colima, and Michoacan for years. They were moving cocaine, distributing weapons, running territory, and doing it with the backing of larger networks that connected to the Sinaloa cartel. Valencia Salazar was embedded in this world, moving pistols, AK-47s, AR-15 to sicarios, and supporting multi-ton cocaine shipments coming up from South America. This wasn't a guy working the corner. He was operating at the organizational level, managing logistics, people, and violence. And then the Milenio Cartel started to fall apart. By 2009 and 2010, Mexico's drug war was exploding under President Calderón's militarized crackdown. The government was coming after these organizations hard, internal fractures were forming, and the Milenio Cartel began fragmenting. When a structure that powerful starts to crack, one of two things happens. Either people scatter and disappear, or the most ambitious and ruthless individuals step into the chaos and build something new. Valencia Salazar was the second type of man, and he wasn't alone. Alongside him was Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, a man who would go on to become arguably the most dangerous drug lord the Western Hemisphere had seen since El Chapo. And for a period of time, L85 and El Mencho were partners. Together, along with other key figures like Emilio Alejandro Pulido Saldaña, known as El Tiburón, they took the remains of the Milenio Cartel's network, aligned themselves under the umbrella of the Sinaloa cartel in Jalisco through the oversight of Ignacio Nacho Coronel, and began forming what would eventually become the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, the CJNG. In June 2009, a public declaration appeared in Mexico that sent a chill through the entire country. Bodies were dumped. A note was left behind that read, "We are the new group, Matazetas, and we are against kidnapping and extortion. We will fight them in all states for a cleaner Mexico." Matazetas, Zeta killers. They were positioning themselves as the anti-Zetas, which helped them gain early political cover and public sympathy in some quarters. Mexican authorities initially brushed them off as a minor faction. That was a catastrophic miscalculation. These guys executed 35 members of rival cartels and dumped the bodies along Mexican highways almost immediately after announcing themselves. By the time anyone realized what they were actually dealing with, the CJNG had already sunk its roots so deep into Jalisco that pulling them out would take over a decade, and even then, they never fully went away. Comment down below. What do you think about the fact that this cartel announced itself to all of Mexico by publicly executing 35 rivals and dumping the bodies on highways? Is this the most brazen cartel power move you've ever heard of? Or have you seen worse? L85's role inside the early CJNG was not small. He was not some low-level soldier who happened to be around when the organization formed. He was a pillar of it. He supervised cocaine and ephedrine shipments from Colombia, managed the recruitment of new members, gathered intelligence on rivals, coordinated attacks against enemy organizations, and helped oversee the kind of violence that allowed the CJNG to rapidly dominate territory. Under his watch, alongside El Mencho's ferocious leadership, the CJNG began its savage expansion across Mexico. And here's something I want you to really sit with for a second. This organization that L85 helped build, this is not just a drug trafficking group. The CJNG became a paramilitary force. They didn't just carry guns, they carried military-grade weaponry, rocket launchers, grenade launchers, armored vehicles, drone technology. Their sicarios were trained in a way that made them look like irregular military units rather than cartel gunmen. They shot down military helicopters. They ambushed convoys of police. In 2015, they blocked a mountain road with burning vehicles and slaughtered 15 police officers who were ambushed with heavy weapons in Jalisco. In 2019, they dumped 19 bodies in Michoacan, 6 of them hanging from a bridge, just to send a message. This is what L85 helped build, and it is important that you understand the full weight of that. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on, because we dive deep into stories exactly like this one all the time, and you don't want to miss a single one. The CJNG didn't just grow, it metastasized. By the time law enforcement fully grasped how dangerous they had become, the cartel had established a presence in most Mexican states, was operating globally, and had positioned itself as the dominant force in the fentanyl, cocaine, and methamphetamine trade flowing into the United States. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration would eventually rank the CJNG as their #1 priority target. The U.S. State Department put a $10 million reward on El Mencho's head. And on February 20th, 2025, under Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the Trump administration designated the CJNG as a foreign terrorist organization, putting them in the same legal category as some of the most notorious terror groups in the world. Not a drug cartel, a foreign terrorist organization. That's the level we're talking about. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because L85 and El Mencho's partnership, the one that built all of this, didn't last. On March 3, 2012, the Mexican army rolled into Lomas Altas in Zapopan, Jalisco. They had received an anonymous tip about armed men at the location. What they found was Eric Valencia Salazar. He was arrested on the spot. The operation immediately triggered a coordinated CJNG response. Cartel operatives hijacked vehicles and set fires across Jalisco and Michoacan highways almost simultaneously. A display of organizational power meant to demonstrate that the cartel could still function and retaliate, even with one of its founders behind bars. But here's where things get murky in the most Mexican cartel way possible. The Army's own account of that arrest was inconsistent. Eyewitnesses disputed claims that soldiers had been fired upon from inside the property. The arrest had been conducted without a proper raid warrant. Evidence, including seized weapons, was mishandled and sent to investigators without proper chain of custody procedures. When you add it all up, those procedural violations gave Valencia Salazar's lawyers exactly what they needed. On December 29, 2017, more than 5 years after his arrest, a federal judge ruled that due process had been violated and ordered L85 released from Puente Grande prison. And this is where I need you to really pay attention, because this is where the story changes forever. When L85 walked out of Puente Grande, something had fundamentally shifted in his world. The CJNG had restructured while he was inside. El Mencho had consolidated power. The vertical command structure had tightened, and there were very serious rumors, which have since been repeated by multiple sources, that it was El Mencho himself who had tipped off the army to L-85's location back in 2012. A betrayal from his own co-founder to remove him as a potential rival for the throne. Whether that's true or not, the fact that those rumors existed tells you everything about the kind of trust that existed at the top of this organization by the time L-85 got out. He walked out of that prison into a world where the cartel he had helped build now viewed him as a threat. The CJNG didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. Instead, there were reportedly threats against him. The organization had moved on. El Mencho had moved on. And L-85 had to make a decision. He made the one decision that guaranteed blood was going to spill. He turned against them. By 2018 into 2019, Eric Valencia Salazar linked up with a man named Enrique Sanchez Martinez, known as El Cholo, another ex-CJNG member who had already drawn the cartel's rage by killing one of their financiers, a man known as El Colombiano. Two men who had burned their bridges with the most powerful cartel in Mexico, now joining forces. Together with Emilio Alejandro Pulido Saldaña, El Tiburon, the third CJNG co-founder who briefly joined the new alliance, they formed a new criminal organization called the Cartel Nueva Plaza, or CNP. And look, I want to be real with you here for a second, because it's easy to get caught up in the operational dynamics and lose sight of what was actually happening on the ground. The violence this cartel war produced in Guadalajara was devastating. People living in neighborhoods across Jalisco, in Zapopan, Tonalá, Tlajomulco de Zúñiga, were waking up every day in the middle of a war between two ruthless criminal organizations. Clandestine graves were found throughout the region. Bodies were appearing in the streets. Residents were trapped in a cycle of terror they had absolutely no control over. That's the real cost behind these power struggles, and we can't just gloss over that. The Nueva Plaza cartel set up operations throughout the Guadalajara metropolitan area. They focused on drug retail markets, extortion, and territory within Jalisco, primarily fighting to chip away at CJNG's dominance in their own backyard. And they did it with an unlikely ally. The Sinaloa cartel, longtime rivals of the CJNG, provided support to Nueva Plaza, essentially using L-85's new organization as a proxy weapon against El Mencho's empire. CJNG hit back hard. El Cholo, the co-leader of Nueva Plaza, was eventually executed by the CJNG. By around 2021, El Tiburon surrendered to Mexican authorities. The Nueva Plaza cartel was battered but not destroyed. L-85 had managed to survive, keeping a lower profile, keeping his head down, but he was still operating. Then September 2022 happened. Mexican Army Special Forces, supported by helicopters, converged on a location in Tapalpa, Jalisco. Tapalpa is a small mountain town about 90 kilometers south of Guadalajara, and it was there that Eric Valencia Salazar was arrested for the second time. The raid seized 37 long guns along with significant quantities of ammunition. L-85 was done running. He was going back into custody, and this time, things would play out very differently. Comment and tell me what you think about this. The man co-founded one of the most powerful cartels ever built, got arrested, was released on a technicality, turned against his own creation, built an entirely new cartel, survived a war with his former partners, and still got caught a second time. Is this guy the most resilient cartel boss you've ever heard of, or just someone who kept making the wrong choices? I genuinely want to know what you think. Here's the thing about being arrested in Mexico when you're someone with the profile of Eric Valencia Salazar. The question isn't just whether you're behind bars, it's whether you're safe. Mexican prisons have a complicated history with high-value cartel figures. L-85 knew better than anyone what the CJNG was capable of, and he knew that sitting inside a Mexican prison with CJNG members potentially sharing space or controlling factions within the walls wasn't a long-term survival strategy. The U.S. had already been building a federal case against him. A grand jury in Washington, D.C. had indicted him back in 2018, charging him with conspiracy to distribute 5 kilograms or more of cocaine for importation into the United States. with alleged conduct stretching back as far as 2003. What came next was part of one of the most significant law enforcement operations in recent memory. On February 27, 2025, Mexico handed over 29 cartel leaders, 29, to United States custody in what officials described as Mexico's largest extradition in years. This was a seismic event. Rafael Caro Quintero was among them. Antonio Oseguera Cervantes, the brother of El Mencho himself, was among them. Leaders from the Sinaloa cartel, Los Zetas, La Nueva Familia Michoacana, the Gulf Cartel, all handed over. And yes, Eric Valencia Salazar, L85, co-founder of the CJNG, was on that plane. They distributed the 29 defendants across 8 U.S. cities, including Chicago, Houston, Phoenix, and Washington. L85 was headed for the nation's capital, where Chief Judge James Boasberg of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia was waiting. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi called the handover a defining moment. The CJNG had already been designated a foreign terrorist organization just days earlier, on February 20th, 2025. The timing wasn't a coincidence. The United States was making a coordinated, unmistakable statement. This cartel is a terrorist organization, and we are coming for every single person who built it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we're going to keep tracking where all of this goes, and there is a lot more coming. Now here's where things take yet another dramatic turn, because while L85 was sitting in U.S. federal custody in early 2025, the cartel he helped build was about to lose its head. On February 22, 2026, Mexican Army Special Forces, supported by U.S. intelligence, located Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes at a ranch in Tapalpa, Jalisco. Yes, the same municipality where L85 had been caught 4 years earlier. The military had tracked El Mencho through one of his romantic partners who visited him there. When soldiers moved in to detain him, CJNG gunmen opened fire. The army responded. 4 cartel operatives were killed at the scene. El Mencho and several others, including bodyguards, were critically wounded during the firefight. They were airlifted toward Mexico City, but El Mencho never made it. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the man who had led the CJNG for over 15 years, the man with $15 million in U.S. reward money on his head, the man whose name was whispered in fear across all of Mexico, died en route. Just like that. The most wanted person in Mexico was gone. The CJNG's retaliation was immediate and terrifying. Narco blockades erupted across 20 to 22 Mexican states. Vehicles were set on fire. Gas stations and businesses were attacked. Tire spikes were thrown across roads. Shootouts broke out. At least 25 National Guard members, state police, and civilians were killed in the immediate aftermath. Prison breaks were orchestrated. 23 escapees in Jalisco alone. The Mexican government deployed 10,000 troops. Schools and municipal offices closed. The U.S. Embassy in Mexico issued shelter-in-place alerts for American citizens. It was chaos. The kind of chaos only a cartel that had burrowed itself into the bones of a country for 15 years could produce when its leader was taken out. And it is almost cinematic, almost poetic in the darkest possible way, that El Mencho died in February 2026, while L85, the man who helped him build everything, was sitting in a U.S. federal holding facility preparing to plead guilty to federal charges. The 2 men who started this together, one dead in a helicopter en route to Mexico City, the other about to walk into a Washington, D.C. courtroom and say the words that would define the rest of his life. Like this video if you're as floored by this timeline as I am. Seriously, this story has layers that most true crime scripts don't even come close to touching. On April 7, 2026, Eric Valencia Salazar appeared before Chief Judge James Boasberg in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. He was 49 years old. He pleaded guilty to 1 count, conspiracy to distribute 5 kilograms or more of cocaine for importation into the United States. That's it. 1 charge, 1 plea. But don't let the simplicity of that fool you for even a second, because behind that 1 charge is decades of calculated violence. tons of narcotics shipped across borders, and a criminal empire built on the bodies of rivals, innocent bystanders, law enforcement officers, and journalists. The U.S. Department of Justice made clear in their press release that this plea carries a mandatory minimum of 10 years in federal prison and a maximum of life. His sentencing is scheduled for July 31, 2026, before Chief Judge Boasberg in Washington, D.C. The DEA, the Justice Department, and federal prosecutors all lined up to mark this moment as significant. And it is, because when you break down what L85 actually did, not just the charge he pleaded to, but the full scope of his operations, you start to understand why the U.S. government considers this a major win. During his years in the CJNG, Valencia Salazar supervised cocaine and ephedrine shipments from Colombia and from suppliers in China. He oversaw the movement of thousands of kilograms of cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl destined for American streets. He recruited members into an organization that, let's be very specific here, was responsible for massacres, for ambushes on security forces, for dumping bodies from bridges, for shooting down military helicopters with rocket launchers. Every shipment L85 moved helped fund all of that. And fentanyl. Let's talk about fentanyl for a moment, because the CJNG's role in the American fentanyl crisis cannot be understated. The cartel became the dominant force in synthetic opioid trafficking into the United States. Fentanyl is approximately 100 times more potent than morphine. A few micrograms is a lethal dose. The CJNG was flooding American communities with this substance at industrial scale. Tens of thousands of American deaths per year are connected to fentanyl overdoses, and a significant portion of that supply traces back to trafficking networks that organizations like the CJNG operated and protected. The money L85 helped move, the routes he helped secure, the violence he helped orchestrate, all of it was downstream from that. I want to be real with you for a moment here, because it's easy to watch a story like this through a kind of criminal underworld lens where it all feels almost like a movie. But every shipment of fentanyl that passed through CJNG's supply chain represents a family somewhere in America that got destroyed. A parent who didn't come home. A kid who called 911 and couldn't save someone they loved. Those consequences are just as much a part of this story as the courtroom moment, and it would be dishonest to tell one without acknowledging the other. Comment and tell me what you think about L85 pleading guilty. Do you think this is justice being served? Or do you think a man like him cutting a deal in federal court still doesn't fully account for the scale of what his organization did? Because honestly, I've been going back and forth on this one myself. Now let's talk about what this guilty plea actually means going forward, because the ramifications of L85 being in U.S. custody and cooperating with the court go far beyond just one man's sentencing. First, information. When a co-founder of one of the world's largest and most violent criminal organizations pleads guilty in federal court, prosecutors don't just file the paperwork and call it a day. They want to know everything. Every name, every route, every operation, every layer of the organization that L85 was privy to from the very beginning. Valencia Salazar was there when the CJNG was formed. He knows the structural DNA of this cartel from the ground up, how it was built, who funded it, how the early relationships worked, what the internal power dynamics looked like before El Mencho consolidated absolute control. That kind of institutional knowledge is extraordinarily valuable to law enforcement, and it doesn't disappear just because a guilty plea has been entered. Second, the CJNG is now operating in a radically different environment than it was even 6 months ago. El Mencho is dead. The cartel has lost its architect, its face, and its strategic engine all at once. L85 is in federal custody in the United States. El Tiburon surrendered years ago. The founding generation of this organization has been essentially eliminated. What happens to a cartel when its founding leadership is gone? History tells us two things. Either the next generation of leaders continues the empire with enough organizational structure to hold it together, or the vacuum creates a brutal internal war for succession that tears the organization apart from the inside. Either outcome means more violence for the people of Mexico, more violence for the communities that have lived in the shadow of this organization for 15 years. And there's a third dimension here that I think is genuinely underreported. What does L85 pleading guilty mean for the Nueva Plaza Cartel, the organization he was running right up until his second arrest? That group is still out there. They're still active in Guadalajara. They've been fighting the CJNG for territory in Jalisco this entire time. With L85 locked up in the US and potentially cooperating, what happens to them? Does the organization fracture? Do its members get absorbed into the CJNG now that the war's central figure is off the board? Does it continue operating under new leadership? These are questions that Mexican security analysts are asking right now, and nobody has a clean answer. Here's the other thing that I think makes this story uniquely significant in the context of what's been happening in 2025 and 2026. The US government's posture toward Mexican cartels has fundamentally changed. The designation of the CJNG and 7 other organizations as foreign terrorist organizations in February 2025 was not a bureaucratic formality. That designation unlocks a completely different set of legal and enforcement tools. Asset freezes become more aggressive. Travel bans extend to associates. U.S. financial institutions face heightened obligations around screening cartel-linked transactions. Law enforcement agencies can pursue prosecutions under terrorism statutes in addition to traditional drug trafficking charges. And perhaps most importantly, the political and diplomatic pressure on Mexico from the United States becomes significantly more intense. You are no longer just dealing with a drug trafficking problem. You are dealing with, legally and officially, a terrorism problem. And the U.S. government has shown, repeatedly, that it treats terrorism designations with a seriousness it often doesn't bring to standard narcotics cases. The 29-person mass extradition of February 2025 was itself a product of this new pressure. Mexico handed over more cartel figures in a single operation than they had in years, not because they suddenly developed a deep moral conviction about fighting cartels, but because the external pressure from the United States under this administration made it politically impossible not to. And L85 was on that plane because of it. The question going forward, the question that nobody in law enforcement, policy, or journalism can fully answer yet, is whether any of this actually changes the fundamental dynamics of Mexican cartel power. The CJNG built its empire over 15 years. El Mencho is gone. L85 is in federal custody and has pleaded guilty. But cartels are not corporations that collapse when their board of directors is arrested. They are adaptive, resilient, and deeply embedded in the economic and social fabric of the regions they control. Taking out leadership, even co-founding leadership, creates turbulence. It does not necessarily create destruction. What it does create is an opening. Whether Mexican and American law enforcement can capitalize on that opening, while the cartel is in its most vulnerable transitional moment, may be the most important question in North American security policy for the next several years. Like this video if you think the US government's crackdown on cartels is moving in the right direction. And comment what you think should happen next, because I genuinely want to know where you stand on whether these prosecutions actually change anything on the ground in Mexico. Let's bring it all the way back to that courtroom in Washington, D.C. on April 7, 2026. Eric Valencia Salazar, L85, 49 years old, born in Santa Clara, California. A man who started in the Milenio cartel, helped co-found the most powerful drug trafficking organization in Mexico, helped build a military-grade criminal empire that shipped tons of narcotics into the United States, got arrested, got released on a technicality, got betrayed by his own co-founder, built a new rival cartel to fight back, got arrested again, got extradited in the largest cartel extradition in years, and then, on a Tuesday in April, stood in a federal courtroom and said guilty. What happens next is in the hands of Chief Judge James Boasberg, with sentencing set for July 31, 2026. The mandatory minimum is 10 years. The maximum is life. Given the scope of what L85 was involved in, given the mountains of evidence, the institutional knowledge prosecutors now hold, the context of a CJNG terrorist designation, the odds that he walks out of federal custody any time in the near future are not good. This is likely the end of the road for Eric Valencia Salazar as any kind of free man. And here's the thing that sits with me when I think about this whole story. The man who helped El Mencho build the CJNG is going to prison in America. El Mencho himself is dead, killed by Mexican forces. The cartel they built together, the organization that massacred rivals, executed police, flooded American communities with fentanyl, and declared itself the rulers of Jalisco and beyond, is now rudderless, transitioning, and under more sustained law enforcement pressure than at any point in its history. Every story has a breaking point. Whether this is the CJNG's breaking point, or whether this empire simply adapts and survives under new management, we're going to find out. And when it happens, we'll be right here covering it. That's the full story of the CJNG co-founder who just pleaded guilty. If there's a piece of this story you want to see us go deeper on, whether that's El Mencho's death, the 29-person extradition, the future of the CJNG, or the Nueva Plaza Cartel's next move, drop it in the comments. And click another box on your screen right now to watch another video covering more stories just like this one.